You've probably realized that cholesterol is not the villain it's made out to be, but that doesn't mean that high cholesterol doesn't matter at all. In fact, I see clients come to me all the time with high cholesterol, and they often think that it doesn't matter because they've been told that high cholesterol isn't actually the cause of heart disease. And while I generally agree with that, that doesn't mean that high cholesterol isn't a problem. High cholesterol is a sign of underlying dysfunction, and we shouldn't ignore it. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 3 most common underlying causes of high cholesterol and what you can do about them. And when I address these issues with my clients, I see consistent reductions in cholesterol values, sometimes of around 100 points in just a few months. For example, this is a 69-year-old male client of mine who I helped to reduce his cholesterol by over 100 points in just 3 months. And this is a female client of mine who is 47 years old, and I helped her reduce her cholesterol by just under 100 points in 4 months. And this was all with the strategies that I'll be going over in this video. Now, before we begin, I do want to mention what I regard to be the optimal range for cholesterol. And I would say that for most people, this is between 160 and 200 milligrams per deciliter. There are some other variables that can affect what might be the optimal cholesterol range for you, but this is the optimal range as far as I'm concerned for the vast majority of people. And with that, a bit of a disclaimer before we dive in. Even though I don't think that high cholesterol values are optimal, I don't think that statins are the answer here. They do lower cholesterol, but they do so at a major cost, and they also, of course, don't fix the underlying problems that are driving the cholesterol up in the first place. So with that, let's talk about the 3 biggest underlying causes of high cholesterol and what to do about them. The first underlying cause is endotoxin, and you might be wondering, what is endotoxin? Endotoxin is a bacterial toxin. It's also called lipopolysaccharide or LPS, and it's a component of various bacteria in your gut, in the intestines. And generally, when we're talking about endotoxin, this comprises a number of different bacterial toxins that can all have very similar effects. And this tends to include highly inflammatory effects inside our bodies. And when we're exposed to this endotoxin, we tend to see increases in cholesterol levels. And the reason for this is that cholesterol itself and the lipoproteins actually protect against endotoxin. They're able to directly bind with and inactivate the endotoxin, and they also bring it to the liver where it can be effectively detoxified. And this is a protective response. As you likely know, cholesterol has a number of benefits, a number of protective effects, and typically when we see that it's increasing, it's adaptive. It's in order to protect our bodies, and this is again one of those circumstances. But that also means that when we're seeing high cholesterol in a case like this, it can be a sign that we have high amounts of endotoxin exposure, which is not a good thing. That's something that we definitely want to address. And normally the underlying causes of this elevated endotoxin involve an imbalanced microbiome, where we're likely lacking in beneficial bacteria, and we're likely exposed to pathogenic bacteria and various other overgrown bacteria. And we're likely also dealing with intestinal permeability or leaky gut, which allows for the endotoxin to then enter into the bloodstream, create inflammatory effects, and also increase cholesterol levels as a protective response. Now, there are a number of different signs and symptoms that this might be the driver of your high cholesterol levels. The biggest ones being obvious digestive symptoms, things like bloating, gas, slow motility, chronic diarrhea, indigestion. If we're dealing with frequent digestive symptoms, or we have to have a very limited diet in order not to have digestive symptoms, this is likely a sign that we do have an endotoxin issue. And on top of that, there are a number of other signs and symptoms that are indirectly related to endotoxin. This could be everything from joint pain to acne, hormonal imbalances like excess estrogen, also various skin issues like eczema, psoriasis, other autoimmune conditions, also symptoms like brain fog. These could all be signs of an underlying bacterial issue and an underlying endotoxin issue. And so if you're dealing with symptoms like this and you have high cholesterol, it's not unlikely that that high cholesterol is due to this underlying endotoxin issue. So if you do think that you have these endotoxin issues, there are a couple of important steps in order to help to resolve this issue. The first one is that we want to reduce the foods that are likely to feed the bacteria, which drives the endotoxin production and absorption. And so these are generally going to be the harder to digest foods, the foods that we don't digest, break down, and absorb, but rather are much more likely to feed bacteria. This includes foods like raw vegetables and also grains, nuts, and seeds, especially ones that are not traditionally prepared. And that's because these grains, nuts, seeds, and raw vegetables often have various anti-nutrients that interfere with our digestion and support the growth of harmful bacteria. and they can also be high in certain types of fibers and carbohydrates that we don't digest and break down, and so instead they're likely to feed bacteria. And then there are also certain types of fruits and even cooked vegetables that are still very high in fermentable carbohydrates, which are the types of carbohydrates that are likely to feed bacteria. So we need to be careful with any of these sorts of plant foods that could be major contributors to feeding bacteria and leading to endotoxin production. That doesn't necessarily mean that these were the primary driver of the endotoxin issue in the first place, but if we're having bacterial overgrowths or imbalances and endotoxin issues, we need to be careful with these foods and instead replace them with easy to digest alternatives, which would be various fruits and well-cooked vegetables and root vegetables that tend to be lower in anti-nutrients and lower in fermentable carbohydrates that feed bacteria. For a full list of the hardest to digest foods that you generally want to avoid and the easy to digest ones that you generally want to include in your diet, make sure to head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide. I have all that listed out so you can just pick the foods that are easiest to digest if you're dealing with likely endotoxin issues, and that way you aren't constantly feeding the bacteria and making these issues worse. So again, to download that free Energy Balance Food Guide, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide. That brings us to the second piece here when it comes to addressing the underlying endotoxin issue, which is addressing the actual drivers of the bacterial growth or the bacterial overgrowth in the first place. This includes things like low stomach acid, poor bile flow, and slow motility. Each of these can contribute to bacterial overgrowths in different ways, where with low stomach acid and poor bile flow, this will interfere with how well we're breaking down the foods that we're taking in, that we're eating, and can lead to undigested food that's more likely to feed bacteria. On top of that, bile is a major antibacterial in our small intestine, so it helps to keep the small intestine clear of bacteria. And then we also have slow motility, where if food is moving through our intestines very slowly, it gives bacteria more of an opportunity to grow and overgrow, and then we can end up with a situation where we have a bacterial overgrowth that's producing a lot of endotoxin. Now, there are a number of underlying factors that can cause these issues, but hypothyroidism is a major one, which happens to be the one that we'll be talking about here next. So the second major underlying cause of high cholesterol is hypothyroidism. Now, most people are told that their thyroid function is totally normal based on their blood tests, but unfortunately, most practitioners, most doctors only check for a single thyroid marker, and that's TSH. So they tend not to check for the various other thyroid markers like T3, T4, and reverse T3, which tell us about the actual values of thyroid hormone that our thyroid gland is producing, as well as how effectively we're converting the inactive thyroid hormone to the active thyroid hormone. So we really can't get a full picture of what's going on with our thyroid function just by checking TSH. That's also because TSH can be influenced by other factors that are mostly independent of thyroid function. But even if we only have the TSH test, we can actually use some other markers to help tell us about our thyroid status, and that includes cholesterol. Most people don't know that high cholesterol levels are an indicator of hypothyroidism. And this relationship between high cholesterol and low thyroid function has actually been known for over 100 years. And you can see this mentioned in this paper from the Mayo Clinic in 1918, where they're describing how low thyroid function can cause high cholesterol levels, and if you properly restore thyroid function, it will lower cholesterol levels. And with this relationship in mind, cholesterol values used to be used as a marker of thyroid status, but this seems to have been forgotten since around the time that statins came out, where after that point, doctors seemed to forget that high cholesterol levels could actually be driven by underlying hypothyroidism and then started prescribing statins instead. Seems to be quite a coincidence. Now, that being said, the 2020 Endocrine Society guidelines still recommend ruling out hypothyroidism before prescribing lipid-lowering medications. Of course, the problem with this is that most practitioners are only using TSH values in order to evaluate thyroid status, and that's not actually an effective marker for looking at thyroid function. So with that, I just want to touch briefly on the two ways that low thyroid hormones leads to high cholesterol. When we have enough thyroid hormone, this increases the uptake and utilization of cholesterol, which lowers cholesterol levels in the blood. And specifically, this happens by increasing the LDL receptor in the liver, which causes the liver to take up the LDL lipoprotein from the blood and lowers blood LDL levels. Now, the second mechanism here has to do with the conversion of cholesterol into our steroid hormones. So many people aren't aware that cholesterol is actually the precursor to all of our steroid hormones. You can't get any steroid hormone, whether we're talking about testosterone, progesterone, pregnenolone, or any other steroid hormone, without cholesterol. And the conversion from cholesterol into any of the steroid hormones depends on having adequate thyroid function. The reason for this is because the active thyroid hormone T3 activates a protein called the star protein. The star protein brings cholesterol into the mitochondria, where it's then converted into the steroid hormones. First, it's converted into pregnenolone, and then it can be converted into the rest of the steroid hormones. And again, this conversion is T3 dependent, thyroid hormone dependent. We need to have enough T3 in order to convert cholesterol into all of the steroid hormones. So in other words, if we're hypothyroid, if we have a lack of thyroid hormones, cholesterol will build up and we'll have a lack of steroid hormones because this conversion is impaired. The other thing that's important to note here is that if you're taking T4, whether it's Synthroid or levothyroxine, or if you have a normal, quote unquote normal TSH level, that doesn't guarantee that you have enough T3. T3 is the active thyroid hormone, and we have to convert T4 into T3. There are a lot of ways that that conversion process can go wrong, and your TSH value on a blood test will not tell you if you're properly converting T4 to T3. And if you're taking T4, again, in the form of Synthroid or levothyroxine, this doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to convert that into the active T3 thyroid hormone. So in other words, if you're seeing high cholesterol in your blood work, it could be a sign of a low thyroid state, even if your TSH is normal, and even if you're taking T4 in the form of Synthroid or levothyroxine, you could be in a low thyroid state due to a lack of T3, the active thyroid hormone. And with that, there are a number of other signs or symptoms to consider that could indicate that we're in a hypothyroid state. And again, this could be due to a lack of total thyroid hormones or a lack of T3 specifically. So if you're generally dealing with low energy or fatigue, a low body temperature, slow motility, trouble digesting fats or proteins, cold hands and feet, thinning hair, dry skin, cracked heels specifically, stubborn weight gain, these could all be signs of a hypothyroid state. So if you're dealing with symptoms like those and we're seeing high cholesterol, it's not unlikely that this could be caused by hypothyroidism. If that is the case, there are some important steps that we want to take. First, it's important to recognize that our thyroid is our general energy sensor. So when our bodies are recognizing that there's not enough energy available for optimal function, there are a number of signals that go on to turn down our thyroid status. And this helps us lower our metabolic rate so that we can conserve energy during this time of low energy availability. With that in mind, if we're in this low thyroid state, it's likely a sign of low energy availability. And when we're talking about energy here, what we're really talking about is the ATP that our cells produce. So if we don't have enough fuel to produce ATP, or we're not producing that ATP efficiently, that can cause this hypothyroid state. And on the other side of the equation, if we're excessively using too much ATP, that could also contribute to this low energy hypothyroid state. So with that in mind, there are a few important steps, a few important things that we want to make sure that we're doing or not doing in order to optimize our thyroid status. The first is we want to make sure we're eating enough total calories. If we're under eating, this will inherently lower our thyroid function because that means we're not going to get enough fuel in, we're not going to have enough ATP, and our body's going to downregulate its metabolic rate. The next step is we want to make sure that we're not excessively wasting energy. So we want to make sure that we're not overtraining or overdoing the exercise. And then we also want to avoid things that tend to drain our energy, that drain our ATP levels. This would be things like cold plunges, like fasting. These are things that will generally cause a low energy state, which will then cause low thyroid function over time. A couple of other things to consider. One is getting enough sleep. A lack of sleep ends up being a major stressor and does end up causing some level of energy depletion. So this is a really important one when it comes to thyroid status. Also addressing psychological stress, which ends up being a huge energy demand, huge depleter of energy, and can therefore cause a low thyroid state as well. Now, there is one other key step, but first I want to mention that I know that these things can be easier said than done, whether we're talking about reducing psychological stress or improving our sleep quality or various other aspects of our health. So I've distilled the most important strategies for addressing all of these factors into the Energy Balance mini course, which you can sign up for free at jfeldmanwellness.com/energy. The Energy Balance mini course is a 7-day email mini course where I'll walk you through the best diet, exercise, and lifestyle strategies to fix your thyroid and also improve chronic cravings and hunger, low energy or fatigue, joint pain, weight gain, digestive issues, brain fog, poor sleep, hormonal imbalances, or various other low energy symptoms. The strategies that I go over in the mini course are all centered around how you can maximize your cellular energy and upregulate your thyroid function. So again, to sign up for the free Energy Balance mini course, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy. And that brings us to the last important step here when it comes to improving our thyroid function, and that's eating enough carbohydrates. The amount of carbohydrates that we eat has a direct effect on our thyroid hormone production and conversion. So in other words, as our carb intake increases, we see increases in the levels of T3, the active thyroid hormone. And the reason for this is because having enough carbohydrates is crucial for keeping our stress hormones low. When our stress hormones are high, again, whether this is due to excess exercise, excess psychological stress, cold plunges, fasting, whatever it is, this increases the stress hormones in order to provide fuel for our body to use in this deficit. And as a result of that, over time, the stress hormones actually have direct effects at the thyroid gland to reduce thyroid hormone production. And they also directly interfere with or reduce the conversion of T4 to T3, which again is the active thyroid hormone. So when we're dealing with high stress hormones, this causes low thyroid hormone production and low thyroid hormone conversion. And eating enough carbohydrates is crucial for keeping the stress hormones down and supporting adequate thyroid function. With that, that brings us to the third and very related underlying cause of high cholesterol, and that's eating too much fat and not enough carbs. Now, we know that a low-carb, high-fat diet reliably increases cholesterol values. This is consistent across the research. We see this all the time. I see this with my clients as well. And it's worth noting that the increase in cholesterol itself isn't a bad thing. Just like we've talked about in these other cases, the increase in cholesterol tends to be a protective response. And in this case, it's not only a protective response, but it's also just a reflection of the change in fuel source. And that's because when our bodies are running on a higher amount of fat, we see higher levels of lipoproteins, which help to transport the fat throughout the body. And the lipoproteins are what we're seeing when we look at cholesterol levels on a blood test. So taking in more fat shifts us to using more fat as a fuel, and the lipoproteins are just the transport system for this fat throughout the body. This is generally called the lipid energy model, and I did go over this in a couple of podcast episodes on the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, so go ahead and check those episodes out if you're interested in a deeper dive on those. But just like we talked about with endotoxin and hypothyroidism, while the increase in cholesterol itself isn't the problem, this is a sign of an underlying issue. And in this case, it's a sign that we're relying excessively on fat as a fuel. And you might say, well, why does that matter if I'm using fat as a fuel as opposed to something like carbohydrates, which are really the only alternative as far as a primary fuel source for the body? Well, there are a number of consequences here when it comes to excessively relying on fat as a fuel. And we talked a little bit about this already when it came to the impact of carbohydrate intake on thyroid hormones. So when we're relying excessively on fat as a fuel in place of carbohydrates, we tend to see higher stress hormones. This helps shift our body away from utilizing carbs as a fuel and towards fats as a fuel. And this is also the result of more inefficiencies in the mitochondria and requiring more stress hormones to drive ATP production in the context of this reduced efficiency. But as we discussed, elevated stress hormones like cortisol, glucagon, and adrenaline have consequences. And one of those is that they reduce thyroid hormone production and conversion, so we end up seeing a lower thyroid state when we're relying more on fat as a fuel in place of carbohydrates as a fuel. And as a result of that, as we talked about when it came to the active thyroid hormone T3 and the relationship with cholesterol, we need enough thyroid hormone activity to effectively convert cholesterol into our steroid hormones. So when we're not eating enough carbohydrates and we're relying excessively on fat as a fuel, and we see lower thyroid function, we then see reduced steroid hormone production. So it's not uncommon to see issues related to hormones, fertility, issues like low testosterone when we're excessively relying on fats as a fuel in place of carbohydrates. And that brings us to another important effect that we tend to see when we're relying excessively on fat as a fuel in place of carbs, which is a lower metabolic rate. We tend to see that over time, our body shifts into that hibernation state and lowers its metabolic rate. in order to survive in this context of a lack of efficient fuel. And this is why we see, this constellation of issues is why we see that many people often feel good initially on a low carb diet. And part of that is actually because of a reduction in endotoxin, which, as we talked about earlier, is a highly inflammatory compound from the gut bacteria. But over time, even if someone's feeling better initially on a low carb diet, we tend to see that these effects catch up with them. And they begin to notice various issues and symptoms, typically low energy. Maybe they're not recovering as well from exercise, often trouble sleeping, either falling asleep or waking up throughout the night. We tend to see slow motility or constipation. We often see increased anxiety and irritability. We tend to see, over time, weight regain. And then in the lab work, we tend to see things like high cholesterol levels and low thyroid function. So if it seems like you're one of these people, if your cholesterol values are high because you're eating a lot of fat and not enough carbohydrates, maybe you're starting to see some of those symptoms that I've mentioned. There are a few important steps we want to take. The first being that we want to work on slowly reducing our fat intake and increasing our carb intake. And there's an important caveat here, because especially when we haven't eaten carbs for a long time, there's a number of ways that this could go wrong. And we need to be careful with the types of carbs that we add in when we've been eating a low carb diet. And most people notice if they aren't careful about this, they'll get bloating, they'll get brain fog, they'll notice weight regain. And these are things that can all generally be avoided if we're careful about the types of carbs that we want to add in. So in order to avoid these things, we need to make sure that we choose the carb sources that are easiest to digest and that are most supportive of our metabolism. And I've put all of this together in a free guide called the Energy Balance Food Guide, where I list out the best carb sources and the easiest to digest carb sources that you'll want to start out with when you're first introducing carbohydrates. You can download it for free at jfeldmanwellness.com/guide. So again, to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide. All right, so that was the 3 biggest underlying causes of high cholesterol. If you address these different issues, you'll likely see pretty major reductions in your cholesterol values and see them come down into that optimal range. But if you need any help or support addressing these things, we'd be happy to help. Just head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/call, where you can sign up for a free call with a member of the J. Feldman Wellness team, and we'll walk you through our different program options for helping you to lower your cholesterol and helping you feel your best. We've helped people lower their cholesterol and reverse everything from insomnia to fatigue and brain fog to severe digestive problems, hypothyroidism, and everything in between. And we'd love to help you do the same. So again, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/call, and we'd be happy to help you out. All right, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.